Martha Wilson stood at her kitchen window, a cup of tea warming her hands as she watched the moving truck pull away from the house next door. The small blue house had been empty for nearly 6 months, and Martha had grown used to the quiet. At 66, she had come to appreciate peace and routine in the 3 years since her husband Tom had passed away. The new owner looked young, maybe early 30s, and very much alone. No wife, no children, just a man with too many boxes and a determined look on his face. Martha noticed how he struggled with a large bookshelf, nearly dropping it on the walkway. She almost went outside to help, but stopped herself. People these days didn't want some old lady butting into their business. Over the next week, Martha learned his name was James. He worked from home, often sitting on his porch with a laptop. Sometimes he looked up and waved when he noticed her in the garden. Martha would wave back, then hurry inside, unsure why she felt so shy. One Tuesday afternoon, dark clouds gathered suddenly. Martha watched from her window as James climbed a ladder to fix something on his roof gutter. The first drops of rain began to fall, but he kept working, getting soaked as the shower turned heavy. "That boy's going to catch his death," Martha muttered, setting down her crossword puzzle. Before she could change her mind, she grabbed her late husband's toolbox and an umbrella. Martha's knees protested as she crossed the lawn between their houses. "Hello there," she called up. "You might want to come down before this gets worse." James looked down, surprise clear on his face. His brown hair was plastered to his forehead, water dripping from his nose. "Just trying to fix this gutter before it gets bad," he called back, his voice friendly despite the rain. "It's already leaking into my office." "Well, you're making it worse standing up there in a lightning storm with metal tools," Martha said. She held up the toolbox. "My husband was good with houses. I picked up a few things. Maybe I can help?" James hesitated, then climbed down, looking embarrassed. "I'm terrible at this stuff," he admitted. "The real estate agent said minor fixes needed, and I thought, how hard could it be?" He ran a hand through his wet hair. "I'm James Foster, by the way. Martha Wilson. Lived here 38 years, so I know all this neighborhood's tricks." She looked up at the gutter. "That's just come loose from the brackets. Easy fix, but not in this weather." James invited her to his porch to wait out the rain. The house was a mess of half-unpacked boxes and mismatched furniture. "Sorry about the chaos," he said. "I moved here after my divorce. Fresh start and all that." Martha nodded, understanding more than she let on. Everyone needs those sometimes. They talked as the rain poured down. James was a graphic designer who could work anywhere with internet. He'd chosen this neighborhood because it reminded him of where he grew up. When the rain stopped, Martha showed James how to secure the gutter properly. Her hands weren't as strong as they once were, but they still remembered the movements. James watched carefully, asking smart questions. "You're a lifesaver," he said when they finished. "I would have made it 10 times worse." "It's nothing," Martha replied, though she felt oddly pleased. Just being neighborly. The next evening, Martha found a container on her porch with a note. "Thanks for saving me from electrocution. I can't fix gutters, but I can cook. Hope you like lasagna, James." The food was delicious, far better than the frozen meals she'd grown used to eating alone. Martha smiled as she washed the empty container, thinking she should return it soon. It would only be polite, after all. The clean container sat on Martha's counter for 3 days before she worked up the courage to return it. She baked a batch of oatmeal cookies, Tom's favorite, as a thank you gift. She hadn't baked in months. The familiar motions felt good, like greeting an old friend. Martha knocked on James's door late in the afternoon. From inside she heard banging and a muffled curse before he opened the door. Behind him she could see a mess of tools and what looked like pieces of a desk on the floor. "Martha, hi." James's face brightened despite his obvious frustration. "Perfect timing. I was just about to give up and burn this stupid desk." Martha peeked around him. "Instructions giving you trouble." "Instructions? I think they're written in alien language." He ran his hand through his hair, leaving it sticking up at odd angles. "I'd give anything for a real workspace right now. My back is killing me from hunching over the coffee table." Martha held out the cookies. "These might help your thinking, and I have a sunroom I never use. It has a big table. You're welcome to work there until you sort out your space." The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise James. Martha hadn't invited anyone into her home in ages. The next day, James arrived with his laptop and a stack of papers. Martha showed him to the sunroom at the back of her house. Sunlight streamed through the windows, lighting up the dust particles floating in the air. "This is perfect," James said, looking around. The table was large, solid oak that Tom had built years ago. "Are you sure you don't mind?" "Not at all. It just sits empty. Shame to waste good space." Martha hesitated. "I'll leave you to it then. Let me know if you need anything." She retreated to her living room with her book, but couldn't focus. Having someone else in the house felt strange. Not bad, just different. After an hour, she heard music drifting from the sunroom, soft jazz, the kind Tom used to play. Martha found herself humming along as she prepared lunch. Almost without thinking, she made 2 sandwiches. She carried them to the sunroom on a tray with 2 glasses of iced tea. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the tray down carefully away from his papers. James looked up, startled. "You didn't have to do that. It's just a sandwich. Nothing fancy." James took a bite and his eyes widened. "This is delicious." "What's in it?" "Secret ingredient. My mother taught me." Martha smiled. "It's just a dash of curry powder in the mayo." They ate together and James told her about his work designing logos for small businesses. Martha surprised herself by sharing stories of when she worked as a school secretary before retiring. This became their routine over the next few weeks. James would arrive in the morning, work in the sunroom, and they would share lunch. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. On Friday evenings, James would bring dinner, always something he cooked himself, dishes Martha had never tried before. "My mom was a terrible cook," he explained one evening as they ate Thai curry. "I learned in self-defense, then found I loved it." Martha's phone rang during dinner. It was her daughter Lisa calling for their weekly check-in. "Who's there with you?" Lisa asked, hearing James laugh in the background. "Just my neighbor," Martha answered. "He's having dinner with me." "A neighbor? Since when do you have dinner with neighbors?" Lisa sounded suspicious. After the call, Martha felt strange. Lisa's questions made her suddenly aware of how much time she and James spent together. What would her children think? What would the neighbors say? James seemed to notice her change in mood. "Everything okay?" Martha nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Fine, just fine." But later, after James left, Martha sat alone in her living room. For the first time in years, the house felt too empty, too quiet, and she wasn't sure what to think about that. Spring turned to summer, bringing warm days and longer evenings. One Saturday morning, James knocked on Martha's door with a bag of gardening supplies in his hand. "I was thinking," he said, squinting in the morning sun, "that strip of land between our houses gets good light. Maybe we could plant a vegetable garden, split the work and the food." Martha stepped outside, looking at the empty space. It had been years since she'd grown anything but the basic flowers Tom had planted before he died. "I don't know," she said hesitantly. "I'm not sure my knees are up for all that digging." "I can do the heavy work," James offered quickly. "You can be the brains. I kill every plant I touch without guidance." That afternoon, they marked out the garden space. James turned the soil, while Martha sat in a lawn chair, directing him where to dig. Mrs. Peterson from across the street walked by twice, staring openly the second time. "Hello, Edith," Martha called, feeling oddly defensive. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Edith nodded without stopping, her eyes darting between Martha and James. "I think we're causing a scandal," James joked after Edith left. "The neighborhood watch is on alert." Martha laughed, but something uneasy settled in her stomach. That evening, she received 3 calls from neighbors asking about her young man friend. By the time the first tomato plants showed tiny green fruits, the whole neighborhood knew about Martha and her young neighbor. Most, like Edith Peterson, watched from a distance with suspicious eyes, but a few, like old Frank Miller who had lost his wife 5 years ago, stopped by to chat while they worked in the garden. "Nice to see you getting out more, Martha," Frank said kindly. Tom would have approved. Martha wasn't so sure about that, but she appreciated Frank's words anyway. On a hot Tuesday in July, Martha's phone rang just as she and James were having lunch on her back porch. "Mom, it's Lisa. I'm in town for a meeting and thought I'd stop by." Martha froze. "Today? Now?" I'm actually about 10 minutes away, is that okay? Of course, Martha said, her heart beating faster. See you soon. She hung up and looked at James. My daughter's coming, she doesn't know about our friendship. James gathered his plate. I'll head home then. Don't want to intrude on family time. No, stay, Martha said, surprising herself. You should meet her. Lisa arrived driving her shiny company car. At 42, she looked like a younger, more polished version of Martha. She hugged her mother stiffly, then noticed James sitting on the porch. This must be the neighbor you mentioned, Lisa said with a tight smile. The one you've been having dinner with. James Foster, he stood and extended his hand. Nice to meet you. Lisa shook his hand briefly, her eyes calculating. Martha could practically hear her daughter's thoughts. Too young, too handsome, too interested in a widow with a paid-off house. James has been helping me with a vegetable garden, Martha explained, gesturing to the plants visible from the porch, and he uses the sunroom as an office sometimes. How neighborly, Lisa said. Her voice made the words sound suspicious. The conversation that followed was painful. Lisa asked pointed questions about James's job, his divorce, his reasons for moving to the neighborhood. James answered politely, but Martha could see his discomfort. Well, I should let you two catch up, James finally said, standing. Thanks for lunch, Martha. Nice meeting you, Lisa. After he left, Lisa turned to her mother. Mom, what are you thinking? He's clearly using you. Men like that target older women living alone. Using me? For what? My amazing wealth? Martha felt anger rising in her chest. We're friends, Lisa, that's all. Men his age aren't friends with women your age without a reason, Lisa insisted. I'm worried about you. That night, after Lisa left with promises to call more often, Martha sat alone in her garden watching the stars appear. She felt tears on her cheeks and wiped them away angrily. The friendship with James had brought color back to her life, but was Lisa right? Was she being foolish? Martha looked over at James's house, where a single light burned in the kitchen window, and felt more confused than ever. For 3 days after Lisa's visit, Martha didn't see James. She noticed his car leaving early and returning late. Once she caught a glimpse of him hurrying from his car to his front door, head down as if avoiding her. The garden between their houses needed water, but Martha's watering can felt too heavy in her hands. She left it half filled on her porch. On the 4th day, Martha's phone rang constantly. First Lisa, then her son Mark, then her youngest, David. Each conversation followed the same pattern. We're concerned, Mom, Mark said, his voice serious. Lisa says this young man is spending a lot of time at your house. He's a friend, Martha repeated for what felt like the 100th time. Mom, men his age don't look for friendship with women your age, David said, echoing Lisa's words exactly. We think you should be careful, maybe stop letting him use your sunroom. By evening, Martha felt drained. She sat on her back porch with a glass of iced tea, watching a storm gather on the horizon. Dark clouds rolled in, matching her mood. Just as the first raindrops fell, a loud crack of thunder shook the air. Martha jumped at a sudden knock on her door. She opened it to find James standing there, soaking wet, rainwater dripping from his hair onto his face. James, you're drenched. Come in, she said, stepping back. James didn't move. I need to say something first. His voice was strained, almost desperate. I've been avoiding you because I thought it was best. Your family clearly doesn't approve of our friendship. Martha felt her chest tighten. I noticed you were staying away. I told myself it was the right thing to do, James continued, rain pelting his shoulders, that I should keep my distance for your sake. For my sake. Yes, but I was lying to myself. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face. His eyes were intense, focused only on her. Martha, I can't stay away. I've tried, but I can't. Martha's heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it over the rain. James, you don't have to. Please, let me finish. He took a deep breath. When I moved here, I was lost. My marriage had failed, my career felt meaningless, and I was just going through motions. Then I met you and suddenly, days had purpose again. Martha stood frozen, raindrops blowing onto her face from where James stood in the storm. I know what people think, he said. I know what your family thinks, but they're wrong. This isn't about convenience or your house or anything else. It's about you, Martha. His voice broke slightly. The way you laugh at my terrible jokes. The way you know exactly when to talk and when to just sit quietly. The way you remember every detail about my work even though it must be boring to you. It's not boring, Martha whispered. The thing is, Martha, I don't care about your age. I care about you. I care about the person who brought me an umbrella in the rain when we first met, who shares lunch with me every day, who taught me how to grow tomatoes. He paused, water dripping from his chin. I think I'm falling in love with you, and it terrifies me. Not because of what others might think, but because I'm afraid you don't feel the same way. Martha's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Men like James didn't fall in love with women like her. It wasn't possible. Yet here he was, standing in the pouring rain, looking at her like she was the only person in the world. Say something, please, James said, his voice barely audible over the storm. Martha stepped forward, out into the rain. She took his cold, wet hand in hers and pulled him inside. You're going to catch your death standing out there, she said softly, closing the door behind him. Then, before she could think too much about it, she stood on her tiptoes and kissed him gently on the lips. When she pulled back, James was looking at her with wonder in his eyes. I've missed you, Martha said simply, and in that moment she didn't care what anyone else thought. Word spread quickly through the small neighborhood. Martha wasn't sure how it happened. Maybe Mrs. Peterson had been watching through her window the night of the storm, or maybe someone had seen them holding hands in the garden. Whatever the cause, by the end of the week, Martha could feel eyes on them whenever they were outside together. Ignore them, James said as they walked to the local farmer's market on Saturday morning. He reached for her hand and Martha hesitated before taking it. They'll get used to seeing us together. Martha wasn't so sure. At the market she noticed how the bread lady who had always been friendly now barely looked at her. The man who sold honey raised his eyebrows when James put his arm around Martha's shoulders. Martha, hello there, called a voice Martha knew well. It was Harriet Green, who ran the town's most active social club and knew everyone's business. Such a lovely day, isn't it? Hello, Harriet, Martha replied, feeling James's hand tighten around hers. Harriet's eyes flicked to their joined hands, then back to Martha's face. I've been meaning to call you. We have a new book club starting for seniors. Thought you might be interested. Thank you, but I'm quite busy these days, Martha said. Yes, I can see that. Harriet's smile didn't reach her eyes. How nice for you. As they walked away, Martha felt her face burning. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea, she murmured. That evening, Martha's phone rang. It was Lisa again. Mom, Mrs. Green called me today, Lisa said without greeting. She says you're dating that young man, that you were holding hands with him in public. Martha took a deep breath. His name is James, and yes, we're seeing each other. The silence on the other end stretched on so long Martha wondered if the call had dropped. Mom, Lisa finally said, her voice eerily calm. This is ridiculous. You're making yourself the talk of the town. A laughingstock. I don't care what people think, Martha replied, though part of her did care very much. Well, I care, and Mark cares. And what about the grandkids? Have you thought about how confusing this is for them? Grandma dating a man closer to their dad's age than hers. The words stung. Martha hadn't thought about her grandchildren's reaction. What would they think? Would they be embarrassed by her? I need to think, Lisa, Martha said finally. I'll call you tomorrow. When James came over that night with a bottle of wine and a movie to watch, Martha was quiet. He noticed immediately. What's wrong? He asked, setting down the wine. Has something happened? Martha told him about Lisa's call. As she spoke, she saw James's face grow more distant. So your daughter thinks I'm… what? Taking advantage of you, hurting your reputation? His voice was tight. She's just worried, Martha said, but even to her own ears, the defense sounded weak. You know that's not true. She's embarrassed. They all are. James stood up and paced the room. They can't imagine that I might actually care about you, that I might see past your age to the amazing woman you are. Martha felt tears building. It's not just my children. It's everyone. You saw how they looked at us today. And that bothers you? James stopped pacing and looked at her directly. Doesn't it bother you? Martha asked. The whispers, the stares. No, James said firmly. It doesn't. Because what we have is worth more than their approval. Martha wanted to believe him. But as she looked at his young face, so full of passion and certainty, doubt crept in. He was only 32. He had so much life ahead of him. Could he really want to spend it with someone who would be 70 soon? Someone who got tired after a short walk, who might need care instead of giving it in just a few years? Maybe we're fooling ourselves, James, she said quietly. Maybe this can't work. James stared at her, hurt replacing the passion in his eyes. You don't mean that. I think I do, Martha whispered, her heart breaking as she spoke the words. I think we need some time apart, to be sure. James stood very still, like a statue in her living room. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked out the door without another word. Martha sat alone in the quiet house, wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. 2 weeks passed without a word from James. Martha saw his car come and go, but he never looked her way when outside. The garden between their houses began to wilt. Martha tried to water it herself, but her heart wasn't in it. She called Lisa as promised, agreeing that perhaps she had been hasty in her relationship with James. Lisa sounded relieved, and soon the calls from her children returned to their normal pattern, brief, distracted, and focused on the grandchildren's activities. Martha listened and made appropriate sounds of interest, but inside she felt hollow. One morning, Martha found her old friend Eleanor on her doorstep, holding a coffee cake. Thought you could use some company, Eleanor said, moving past Martha into the house without waiting for an invitation. At 72, Eleanor had been widowed twice, and now lived with a man 15 years her junior. The gossip brigade says you've been hiding away. Martha made coffee while Eleanor cut the cake. They sat at the kitchen table, and Martha found herself telling Eleanor everything. So you sent him away because of what people think? Eleanor asked when Martha finished. Since when do you care about Harriet Green's opinion? It's not just that, Martha said, staring into her coffee. It's my children, my grandchildren, and he's so young, Eleanor. What could he possibly want with me in the long run? Eleanor laughed, a sharp sound that made Martha look up. Martha Wilson, I've known you for 40 years and I've never heard you talk such nonsense. That boy looks at you like you hung the moon. Anyone with eyes can see it. He's not a boy. He's a grown man who should be with someone his own age. Should be. According to whom? The rule book of proper behavior? Eleanor leaned forward. Let me tell you something. After Richard died, I was ready to follow him. Then I met Carl, and he gave me a reason to live again. Do you think I care that he's 57 while I'm 72? Age is just a number after 60, my dear. Martha shook her head. But what about 10 years from now? 20? I'll be in my 80s while he's still young. None of us knows what's coming tomorrow, let alone in 20 years, Eleanor said gently. But I do know this. Joy is too rare in this life to throw it away because of other people's opinions. After Eleanor left, Martha went into Tom's old study. She hadn't changed anything since his death. His books still lined the shelves, his reading glasses still sat on the desk. She opened the bottom drawer where she kept his journals. Tom had written in them every day for 40 years. Martha pulled out the last one, from the year before he died. She turned to his final entry, one she had read so many times the page was soft from handling. My greatest wish for Martha, Tom had written, is that she finds joy again when I'm gone. Not just contentment, but real joy. She deserves that. Martha closed the journal, tears rolling down her cheeks. What would Tom think of James? She couldn't know for sure, but she suspected he would have liked him, his kindness, his humor, his gentle way with her. That evening, Martha noticed a letter in her mailbox. Her name was written in James's neat handwriting. Inside was a simple note. I'm still here when you're ready. No pressure, no rush. I just want you to know that nothing has changed for me. I miss our talks. I miss your laugh. I miss you. At the bottom of the letter was a sketch of their garden, not as it was now, neglected and dying, but as it could be, full of vegetables and flowers. Martha sat on her porch until sunset, the letter in her hands. The world would always have opinions. Her children would always worry, but maybe Eleanor was right. Maybe joy was too precious to waste. As darkness fell, Martha looked at James's house. A light was on in his kitchen, just as it had been that night 2 weeks ago. Martha stood up, folded the letter carefully, and put it in her pocket. Then, with slow but determined steps, she walked across her lawn toward his door. Martha's heart pounded as James opened his door. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then, without a word, he stepped aside to let her in. His house was tidier now. Books lined up on shelves, pictures hung on walls. It looked like a real home, not the half-unpacked space she remembered. "Would you like some tea?" James asked, his voice careful, neutral. Martha nodded and followed him to the kitchen. She sat at his table while he filled the kettle and took down 2 mugs. His movements were smooth but tense, like he was trying hard to act normal. "I got your letter," Martha said finally. James nodded without turning around. "I meant every word." "I've missed you too," Martha admitted. "More than I thought possible." The kettle whistled and James poured water into the mugs. He set one in front of Martha and sat across from her. His eyes, when they met hers, were guarded. "I've been thinking," Martha said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "About us? About what matters at my age." She took a deep breath. "I spent my whole life doing what was expected. Being a good daughter, then a good wife and mother. Always following the rules." James listened silently, waiting for her to continue. "But now I wonder, what's the point of living to 66 if I can't finally make my own choices, if I can't decide for myself what makes me happy?" A small smile touched James's lips. "And what does make you happy, Martha?" "You do," she said simply. "The time we spend together. The way you see me as Martha, not just as someone's mother or grandmother. Not as an old lady who needs looking after." James reached across the table and took her hand. "I've never seen you that way." "I know. And that's part of why I—" Martha paused, then decided to be brave. "Why I love you." The words hung in the air between them. James's hand tightened around hers. "I love you too," he said. "I think I have since you showed me how to fix that gutter." They both laughed, breaking the tension. James stood and came around the table, pulling Martha to her feet and into his arms. "So where do we go from here?" he asked, holding her close. "I don't know exactly," Martha admitted, "but I think we should find out together." Over the next month, Martha and James rebuilt what they had lost. They tended their garden, shared meals, and talked for hours. But this time, Martha didn't hide their relationship. She held his hand when they walked in town. She introduced him properly to Frank Miller and other neighbors who stopped by. Martha also called a family meeting. All 3 of her children arrived at her house on a Sunday afternoon, their faces showing a mix of concern and confusion. James was there too, sitting beside her on the couch as she faced her family. "I've asked you here because we need to clear the air," Martha began. "James isn't going anywhere. He's part of my life now, and I need you all to accept that." Lisa started to protest, but Martha held up her hand. "I've listened to your concerns. Now you'll listen to me." Her voice was firm but gentle. "I spent 40 wonderful years with your father. I will always love him, but he's gone, and I'm still here. I didn't expect to find love again, especially not with someone younger. But I have, and it's made me happier than I've been in years." Martha looked at each of her children. "I'm not asking for your approval. I'm asking for your respect, for my choices, for my happiness." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then David, her youngest, stood up. He walked over to James and extended his hand. "If you make my mother happy, that's good enough for me," he said. Mark followed his brother's lead. Only Lisa remained resistant, but even she seemed less certain in her opposition. As her children left that evening, Martha felt lighter than she had in months. Standing in the doorway with James's arm around her shoulders, she watched them drive away. "That went better than I expected," James said. "It's a start," Martha replied. Then she turned to him with a smile. "You know, I've always wanted to see the Grand Canyon. Tom and I talked about it, but we never went." James' eyes lit up. "Are you suggesting a trip?" "I'm suggesting an adventure," Martha said. "The first of many. What do you think?" James pulled her close and kissed her, right there in the open doorway where anyone passing could see. "I think," he said, "that sounds perfect."